It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Frank Weichold from the United States Food and Drug Administration, and he will give us a very needed and important view on regulatory considerations for assessment of immunotoxicity of nanoparticles.
Thank you, Marina. We all know that Beat Löffler is very convincing if he wants something. And he told me, you have to speak in the immunology session. And so I am here, even though we at FDA very closely collaborate with the NCL laboratory. It's one of our core resources for information and capacity. And as such, let me just go through some of the basic considerations that will not surprise you. I'm not going to present you new primary data. This is all published information. And I shall also make the disclaimer that what I'm talking about is my personal opinion. I have obtained approval from FDA leadership to give that presentation. And as such, we are all aware of the increasing complexity. We don't have to debate this. We need to build preparedness. You have heard me say that several times here. One of our strategies is to create platforms where we can improve science, better networking, and better training. And certainly the Nanotechnology Task Force plays a critical role in that. Staff training is critical. Marina mentioned some of the capacities and opportunities that NCL offers. We certainly always take advantage of that. We do regular training for our reviewers and also the experts who work in the laboratories of the NCTR, which is the National Toxicology Center in Arkansas, which is an integral part of the Food and Drug Administration. Now, risk assessments for nanomaterials are, of course, very similar to all of that, what you've heard before about chemistry, structure, morphology, and it is that we also here take a risk-benefit approach in order to evaluate materials. Now, some of the discussions and presentations that were given, I cannot emphasize enough the attention that we pay to not just LPS and lipotaconic acid, but pyrogens in general. And it's always a danger signal when in the clinic physicians have to administer a large amount of hydrocortisone to mitigate any of the potential risk to induce any acute reaction to a product. And as such, we are aware that the current standards that include the limitless amebicide lysate test and its derivatives, as well as the monocyte activation test, which has been standardized also within the European Union in some of the specific working groups that deal with that, are not always sufficient to detect everything. So for the amebicide test, we have to be aware of the fact that the horseshoe crab is evolutionary quite far away from a human, and what we can detect there is not identical what we see in human. Certainly, Marina pointed to some of the limitations in rabbits, even though it's still considered the gold standard that we use to compare any replacement method. And yet, I hit the wrong button, I'm sorry for that. Again, the approach is to use risk categories, not much different from the approaches that I have alluded to. So I'm not going to spend much more time on this. Certainly, I will go a little bit into the different priorities right now for the different centers. We have 8 centers at the FDA. CDER, the largest center with about 5,000 employees. Majority of them are actually scientists. So dissolution testing, alternative release testing methods are critical and relevant. And of course, when it comes to different products, permeability, systemic absorptions, and the like on the focus of the attention. But that's not in disconnect. Immunogenicity, pyrogenicity is not in disconnect with other considerations in terms of product quality, stability, and impact, and if you want to call it immune toxicity. So CDER, very similar actually, and many of the activities are worked on in a collaborative way, addresses this in a very similar way. I think one of the challenges that we face right now practically is that the Office of Product Quality does not have a dedicated subgroup that focuses on immunology, and I think that's a shortcoming that we need to address. But again, we have a very functional working relationship with the NCL and MOU and the active exchange of information, so I think we can mitigate some of that risk that poses. Now, I mentioned to you the NCTR, National Center for Toxicology Research. You see some of the details of the broadly FDA-focused research and investigations that are conducted. A lot of that, what you see on the list, is, of course, in the food sector. And just to expand, I mean, many of us are thinking in the context of medical products and nanomaterials, but it hasn't escaped you that food does contain nanomaterials, of course, some of the oxides, and they pass through, and yet it is not clear what effect these materials have on the microbiome, on intestinal transporters, and how they interfere with physiological processes. So again, the focus of the group that I'm coordinating within the agency, for the agency, is to build platforms and strategic alliances, research platforms and strategic alliances to leverage worldwide capacity and expertise to the benefit of regulation and approval of medical products and products that are regulated by the agency. One of the examples here that was work that particularly CDER colleagues, specifically Jan Zimak, has been involved with, is to look at the effects of nanomaterials in blood platelets. We all are aware of the fact that platelets are pretty sensitive to manipulation, and as such, certainly one of the criteria that we have in mind. We know that nanomaterials interact and affect the outcome. For your reference, I listed a few publications here. That's not new material, you can look it up. As such, I'm not going to spend much time. We also know that carbon nanotubes affect platelets, and I think there are some results that are quite intriguing, namely how you can actually change that by particular manipulations, such as triggering of efflux mechanisms. So again, that's a field of active research taken into consideration. The summary here looks familiar to you. Facilitation through building appropriate research capacity and preparedness. FDA maintains a product-focused and science-based regulatory policy, and certainly we have to leverage legal standards. In the food sector, that is a little bit more complicated because anything that's regarded as safe by any of the producers, we call it the GRAS rule, generally regarded as safe, doesn't necessarily require any additional information about the material that's included. However, if new, and particularly in the context of man-generated, such as nanomaterials, are part of food, of course there is a voluntary submission of that information and consideration how that impacts the safety of this particular product. As it is obvious to you, because we cannot, particularly in the food sector, proactively or pre-market approve, we have to have a very active and functional post-market surveillance system. And there are challenges. I think with the advancement of technology, we will get better. Typically, MedWatcher gives us about only 10% of adverse event reporting. That is certainly something we need to address as an agency, but also as a society with all the stakeholders. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. Now, again, the recommendation here when you come to the agency is to interact early, make use of published material, and when it comes to building agency preparedness, I think I've shared enough reference information which way you can approach us and which way we internally use, and I guess I would say networking, active collaborations, and trying to identify synergies also among the regulatory agencies is in the focus of our attention. With that, I would like to thank people who contributed to this presentation, specifically Jan Zimak, Celia Grus, Jed Costanza, and Anil Petri, and of course, you have heard it many times, Nanotechnology Task Force and the Nanotechnology Reviewer Network. With that, I thank you very much, and I take your questions.
Thank you very much. Questions to Dr.? Yes, one question.
Everything is clear. Wonderful.
Well, it was a very precious lecture, and particularly to know that your eyes are on us immunologists.